welcome to the show. Once again, we're talking about the national debt. And here with us today, we have Stephen. Steve, could you introduce yourself?
It's a pleasure, Shane. Yes, my name's Stephen Hale. I'm an associate professor in economics with Torrens University, Australia. I used to train central bankers in the UK in the 1990s. I've lived in Australia for about 20 years now. I spent most of that time working at one of our, you might call it Ivy League universities, which is the University of Adelaide a couple of years ago. I left that uni to launch a global online program in modern monetary theory and ecological economics with Torrens University, Australia. What else can I say? I published a book called Economics for Sustainable Prosperity in 2018. My most recent academic paper was with someone called Mark Diesendorf that was published last year about paying for an energy transition around the world. And I'm spending a lot of time at the moment promoting the new movie that features Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton, another MMT economist, called Finding the Money, which is coming to Australia next year, but is on the film festival circuit in the US as we speak.
Okay. Thanks for joining me today. Let's go ahead and get started with the first question. So, in the United States, what's the mainstream claim about the federal debt?
Well, you know that better than I do, really. In the United States, I think the same. The mainstream claim is the same in the US as it is in many other countries. Yes. Which is that, in some sense, the debt at some point will become unsustainable. I'm not sure what people mean by unsustainable, but that's what they say.
And what led you to believe that claim is inaccurate?
There are a variety of ways of answering this question, depending on how much detail you want to go into. If I'm talking to a bunch of economists, I'll answer it one way. If I'm teaching a course, I'll answer it another way, looking at balance sheets. But if you're just talking to a member of the public, you just talk about the intrinsic realities of a monetary system with a currency issuing government sitting at the top. So I'd usually say, suppose I'm the government and you're the private sector. Suppose I spend $10, that every dollar I spend as a currency issuer is a new dollar, and those $10 go into your bank account, and I tax $8 back out of your bank account. I've run a deficit of $2, but looking at it from your point of view, you've got $2 in your bank account in your savings you didn't have before. So from your point of view, you're running a surplus. The government's deficit is everybody else's surplus. If I do that year on year on average, then every time I run a deficit, I'll be adding to my debt, if you want to call it a debt. And that's what in the US people call the national debt. All those dollars that the federal government has spent into the monetary system and not yet taxed back out of them. What people often forget is that those dollars are the savings of everybody else, the savings in US dollars, in safe financial assets of the US private sector and the rest of the world that wants to hold on to US dollars. Now, people call that the national debt. It's obviously not your debt, Shane. If you've got funds in pension investments, then some fund manager on your behalf is probably holding some treasury bonds that have been issued by the government to match their deficit spending. It's a safe financial asset for the US private sector. It's not a debt for the private sector. It's in no sense a burden for the private sector. Quite the opposite, actually. It's your financial wealth.
Exactly. And you also answered my second question, which is, what is the national debt? At least.
Yeah, all the dollars that the federal government has ever spent and not yet taxed out of the system. That's all it is.
So, just to follow up to that, does that mean that this debt is not going to be a burden that our children and grandchildren have to pay back?
Well, on the face of it, if you were to pay back the national debt, at least the gross debt of the government, then the US dollar wouldn't exist anymore. Your monetary system wouldn't exist any longer. So I find it very difficult to understand when people talk along these lines. It's generally that they don't understand money and the monetary system, or they've never thought about it very carefully. So they think the government is like a household. And of course, if you are a household and you deficit spend, you borrow over time, you accumulate debt, then you have to pay back that debt, or you go bankrupt, you become insolvent, you have terrible financial circumstances to deal with because you run out of money and you run out of people to lend you money. If you're the currency issuer, that obviously doesn't apply to you, and there's no parallels between a household or a business or a not-for-profit, or for that matter even a state government, and the federal government that sits at the top of the monetary system, that spends by currency issuance, that can't possibly run out of its own currency. That doesn't mean you can't have crazy politicians in Washington, D.C. decide not to spend the currency or to close the government down or something, but that's not being forced upon them. The US government can never and will never be forced to run out of its own currency. It can never become insolvent. The currency that it spends into the system and doesn't tax out of the system, that ends up being the national debt. Well, if it spends too much alongside the private sector spending too much and goes beyond the productive capacity of the economy, that will help to bid up prices and add to inflationary pressures. But that's the only constraint that there is on spending by the federal government, and the federal government's spending, which it hasn't taxed out of the system yet, the national debt, is, as I said before, just the savings of everybody else. It can't really become unsustainable in the sense that they can't continue to do it. The worst thing that could happen is that it could be inflationary.
Okay. So I have a two-part question for you now. Is the U.S. a currency issue? Are there other countries that are currency issuers? And does that is what you're saying true, not just for the U.S., but for any country that is a currency issuer?
Most countries, most nations issue their own currencies. Obviously, not all of them. We could mention some in Europe that's not true of, but most countries issue their own currencies. Not all countries have the same freedom of action as far as the use of the government budget is concerned that the US has. The US is a full, what we often call a monetary sovereign. In fact, it's the fullest monetary sovereign in the world. It has the greatest degree of freedom in terms of deficit spending, given the role that the US dollar plays in the global monetary system and will do for some time to come. But there are a significant number of other countries. I'm sitting in one of them. Australia, Canada is another, Japan is another, the UK is another. They're not all big countries. New Zealand is another, that we describe as full monetary sovereigns that have virtually the same degree of freedom of action that the US does. To be a full monetary sovereign, you have to issue your own currency, which you collect taxes denominated in, and the fact that people have to pay their taxes using your currency means there will always be a demand for your currency. But you also need to not commit to exchange your currency at a fixed rate or fixed price for any commodity like gold or any foreign currency that you could possibly run out of. And you also have to have no significant foreign currency denominated debt. Now, under these circumstances, you as a full monetary sovereign currency issuing government cannot ever become insolvent. That concept simply does not exist. You could spend too much or spend too much on the wrong things. So you could drive inflation, you could contribute towards ecological breakdown, but you can't run out of your own currency, and you don't have any what we call liabilities. You don't have any debt in any other currency or anything that you could ever run out of. And that's true of the US, but it's true of Australia too. It's not only the US government that's true of.
So every dollar in my wallet, would you consider that part of the national debt?
Every dollar in that's where, if you want to go into the detail of it, it becomes a little bit more complicated, because actually, in a sense, for every dollar in your wallet, the Federal Reserve is holding some federal government debt. So but yes, is the short answer to that question. Every dollar in your wallet is a liability in an accounting sense of some part of the broadly defined US government, including the Federal Reserve.
So if the US government or any other government were to pay back the debt, what kind of info and stop issuing debt instruments and doing that, what kind of impact would that have on its economy?
Well, I'm in favor of the Federal Reserve not issuing treasury bonds, but that's because I'm in favor of the Federal Reserve Bank doing essentially the same thing. We need debt instruments issued by governments like the US government or their central bank, because those instruments play an important role in modern monetary systems. Your fund manager, people watching this video that are going to rely when they're older on income from a pension fund, wants to hold safe US dollar assets that pay interest over time. And if you're going to have a monetary system like that, then you need part of the government to issue those instruments. It is also the case that treasury bonds play a very important role in the global financial system for a variety of reasons, including collateral on a variety of financial transactions. So it just wouldn't be a good idea to do away with treasuries. And Stephanie Kelton often says that when she talks to politicians in Washington and says, do you want to pay off the debt? Many of them say yes, enthusiastically. But then when she says, does that mean you don't want to issue treasuries anymore? They say no, and they don't realize that they're contradicting themselves.
What is the difference between being a currency issuer only and also being a full monetary sovereign?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about, really. But if you're talking about countries that have very high levels of US dollar denominated debt, the problem is that if you have a lot of US dollar debt, you have debt in a currency that you don't issue. So if you're Argentina and you're carrying a lot of US dollar debt, which perhaps you built up in the past because you were trying to defend an overvalued fixed exchange rate, and in order to do that, you needed to buy your own currency. And in order to buy your own currency to support its value, you needed US dollars, and you didn't have the reserves, so you went and borrowed them. So you've built up US dollar debt over time. You need to service that debt if you're not going to default on that debt. If under those circumstances, if you issue your own currency, the peso, in pursuit of full employment in Argentina, and if that helps to contribute towards a weak trade position, and if that puts downward pressure on your currency, then you have a difficult set of economic circumstances to manage there. If your currency collapses, then that drives the price level up. It can undermine the standard of living of people who already have a very low standard of living, because the cost of imported essentials like energy and perhaps food go up, and that can drive social instability. Or if you try and defend your currency, well, you're going to get to the point where you run out of the ability to borrow US dollars, because you're now seen as being a very high risk in terms of default. And under those circumstances, you may face a situation where you don't have many obviously good options. You might feel you have to go to the International Monetary Fund and ask for a bailout, and with that bailout will come a structural adjustment program where they'll force you to do some very difficult and unpleasant and destructive things as far as your domestic economy is concerned. So you simply don't have the freedom of action that a currency issuer like the US government, that has no significant foreign currency debt, or for that matter, the Australian government that has no significant foreign currency debt, is concerned. Our government has not had foreign currency denominated debt for more than 20 years in Australia. Our currency has been floating in Australia. We have an economy which is resilient to significant fluctuations in exchange rates in Australia. Consequently, our government is a full monetary sovereign is in a very different position to the government of Argentina or Turkey or most countries around the world, where building monetary sovereignty is something that has to be done over a period of years, where you don't have in the short run the same sort of freedom of action that Canada or the US or Japan or Australia enjoy already.
So just to kind of clarify, when you issue debts in your own currency, and
well, hang on, when you issue debts, let's take a step back, shall we?
Okay.
Sorry to okay, I spend $10, I tax $2, I have a $2 deficit. That $2 for you is a surplus of the private sector. It's sitting in your bank account. Now, in Australia for about 40 years, in the US for about 70 years, we have had the habit of offering the private sector treasury securities, treasury bonds, to give the private sector the option to take those $2, which are in a transaction account, and convert them into $2 worth of treasury bonds, which is effectively a savings account, an interest-bearing savings account at the central bank. So that's where the issuance of treasury bonds has come in. Now, prior to the global financial crisis in the US, there was kind of a good reason for auctioning treasury bonds to match deficit spending, which was that the Fed Reserve used to control the federal funds rate, interest rates in the US, by keeping the banking system very short of reserves, rationing reserves to the banking system. And deficit spending by the government puts additional reserves into the banking system. So auctioning treasury bonds used to drain those excess reserves off again and help to support the federal funds rate, to prevent the federal funds rate going to zero when the Fed didn't want that to happen. Since the global financial crisis in the US, there's been waves of quantitative easing, so that even though they're not doing this at the moment, in 2023, US banks have massive amounts still of excess reserves. So the issue of draining excess reserves from the system is not an issue anymore. And the way that they control the federal funds rate now is essentially simply that they pay interest on those reserves now. And if they want to drive up short-term interest rates in the US, they just increase the interest rate that they pay on all those reserves which banks are holding. What this means is that there is no essential need to issue treasury bonds any longer when you deficit spend. And auctioning treasury bonds to match deficit spending by the government is an institutional practice which they continue with, but there's no absolute need to do.
So, because both these countries, US and Australia and others, are monetary sovereigns,
yeah,
and they're doing this, they are issuing the interest that you gain in their own currency, so they cannot run out or default on these payments, correct?
They don't have to issue the interest either. They're doing that essentially because they don't want zero interest rates in their economies. I know you've spoken to Warren Mosler, and Warren has often argued for a zero interest rate policy. That doesn't mean everybody pays zero interest rates on their loan, but it means that if you're not taking a risk when you hold currency, you should get a zero interest rate on it, and there's zero default risk on treasury bonds. So if the Fed was to say we're going to keep the risk-free interest rate in the US at zero indefinitely, then the government wouldn't need to pay interest on treasury bonds in the first place. So you're paying interest on these bonds because you don't have a zero interest rate policy. What you're doing effectively is a monetary policy measure, really, not a fiscal policy measure. It's not something which is to do with funding government spending, which, as we said, is always funded out of currency issuance anyway. Auctioning the bonds in the first place used to be about supporting interest rates in the US economy, and paying interest on those bonds is also about supporting interest rates. Having a high debt to GDP ratio, which the US now has relative to its recent history and relative to many other countries, has interesting implications for the US economy. One of those implications, which again Warren often mentions, is that you've got to the point now in the US where small increases in interest rates seem to accelerate spending in the US rather than to reduce them, because they increase the amount of interest that the government pays to the private sector. In Australia, that's much less likely to happen because we have much less government debt in Australia compared to our GDP than the US does. So there's interesting effects on the monetary system and on how fiscal and monetary policy work, which relate to the amount of government debt out there in the system. But it's, as we were saying before, it's in no sense a burden, and maybe we shouldn't call it the national debt at all. I don't particularly like this term because it confuses people who are familiar with official measures of the money supply, but Warren talks about the national debt as the net money supply, the net supply of US dollars to the private sector and the rest of the world from the federal government. And I guess that's fair enough.
Okay. So, how is deficit spending funded?
Deficit spending is just like any other spending by the federal government. It's funded when it's authorized, in the US by Congress, in Australia by our parliament. If you can pass a budget through parliament or through Congress, then that spending is authorized, and spending which is authorized by Congress or parliament will be enacted on behalf of the federal government by the central bank, in the US by the Federal Reserve.
My final question is, what happens when you have a surplus? Is it bad to have a surplus in a deficit?
No, a surplus is not necessarily intrinsically bad. There are circumstances where it might be appropriate for governments to run a surplus, particularly when the country is running a large trade surplus with the rest of the world. So if you're Norway or Singapore, with all that demand coming into your economy from the rest of the world, in order to keep total spending below the productive capacity of the economy, or at the productive capacity of the economy, and for it not to be inflationary, then it might be appropriate for the government to run a surplus, because under those circumstances, the government and the private sector can run a surplus at the same time, because the rest of the world is in deficit on your monetary system. But this is not the case in the US. It has not been the case in the US for a very long time, and it's not going to be the case in the US in the foreseeable future. The US runs trade deficits. That's basically because the rest of the world wants and needs US dollars, and the rest of the world gets those US dollars by running trade surpluses with the US. In Australia, at the moment, our government is running a tiny budget surplus for the first time in quite some years. And that is a reflection of the fact that Australia, for the first time in a long time, is running a significant trade surplus right now, for reasons I'm not proud of. We export a huge amount of coal to China and elsewhere, and we export a huge amount of natural gas too. So we are, you might say, polluting the world with vast amounts of fossil fuels. As a consequence of that, of course, we're running a trade surplus. It means the rest of the world is in deficit with us. That means that it is at least theoretically possible for our government and our private sector to be in surplus at the same time. This is not true of the US. In the US, it is not possible for the private sector to be net saving, to be in surplus, without the federal government running a deficit. And that is what will happen in the US in the foreseeable future, with the exception of periods where you are foolish enough to run Clinton-type surpluses. If that happens again, the consequence of that will be in the US either a depression or a financial crisis, and something like the Great Recession of 2009. It's not something that we ought to be doing. The Clinton surpluses of the late 1990s were far from a triumph for responsible management by the Democratic Party. They were catastrophic. They went alongside financial deregulation, allowing the private sector and especially households to go far into deficit, allowing non-currency issuers to build up very high levels of debt. And of course, there were then the defaults and the collapse of the system about 10 years later.
Okay. Thank you for joining me today, Stephen. I appreciate all of your insights. And
thanks very much, Shane. It's a pleasure.
See you again.